gentlemen, as you know, Mr. Allen has been in the thick of the Cold War since its very beginning. You're familiar with his very distinguished record as a career diplomat and troubleshooter. But just for the record, let me recall a few of its high spots. 4 times in critical periods, he was assigned to frontline ambassadorial posts in Iran, Yugoslavia, India, and Greece. He has been Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East, South Asia, and Africa. In 1948, when Congress decided we ought to have an overseas information program on a more or less permanent basis, Mr. Allen was put in charge. And last fall, the President decided that this important activity needed Mr. Allen again. He brought him home from overseas and made him Director of the United States Information Agency. Mr. Allen attends the meetings of the Cabinet and the National Security Council. Mr. Allen, why is it that everything the other side says is propaganda while we call what we say information?
Mr. Lindley, the word propaganda has taken on a very bad connotation. It was originally a perfectly good word, but it brings to people's minds now the idea of twisting or distorting the truth or even manufacturing complete falsehoods. Whereas we try in our service, our output, to give as straight the factual presentation as we can, and we feel that that is information and it should be labeled that, not called propaganda.
I wonder if you could give us an example of Soviet propaganda, particularly as applied to the armed services, which these gentlemen represent.
Well, I had today with me a book that the Soviet government puts out for its training course of the armed services of the Soviet Union. The book is called Marxist-Leninism on War and the Army. I'll just read you one description of the way it talks about American Army officers. It said U.S. armed service officers are corrupt, weak, run by Wall Street, and, quote, professional robbers, end quote. Well, I call that propaganda.
Well, Mr. Allen, that applies to all officers of the armed forces. Do you have a comparable piece of the Soviet propaganda that applies specifically to the Army?
Well, I'd like to show you on that a film of the meeting of the American and the Soviet armed forces at the Elbe, the River Elbe, at the end of the last war. And you'll see how the Soviet government and their information service presents this meeting of the two armies. Could we have the film?
Let's see what really happened at the Elbe before we view scenes from the Soviet film. We are outside of Torgau, Germany, on the 26th of April, 1945, at the first official meeting of the American and Russian armies. The film you are seeing was made by Signal Corps photographers of the United States Army. You will see a glimpse of the Elbe River Bridge in the background. The meeting took place to arrange a meeting of Corps commanders on the following day. Prior to this time, only patrols of the two armies had contacted each other. Here are Major General Emil F. Reinhardt, Commanding General of the 69th Division, 5th Corps, United States Army, and Major General Rusakov, commanding the 58th Guard Division, Red Army. General Reinhardt said, and I quote, "I crossed the river and waited for a short time as the Russians thought the meeting was later than 1600 hours. Rusakov and I discussed the details for meeting of the two Corps commanders the next day. I was impressed most with the cordial attitude of the Russians." Unquote. Now to the Soviet version, complete with Korean dialogue.
김여동님 보고하겠습니다. 연합군 미국 사람들입니다. 참 전쟁 끝판에 비로소 제2등 손으로 보게 되니 정말 재미가 있는걸. 저리가.
made in Germany.
큰 베이스. 독일 대망원경은 정말 훌륭한 것. 이런 소비에트
Made in Russia.
이름난 오게페우 공장의 제품이죠. 오게페우.
Now for the Soviet proof that our army officers are corrupt, as we see our play-acting general dally on the doorstep of decadence, complete with lady friend and stock ticker in his office. This is a literal translation of what they're saying. General, what's this? What's this? Girlfriend. What's the market doing? General, my stocks are going up. Girlfriend, sell for the profit. General, get me my broker. Yes, Wall Street. I'm making money like crazy.
요새 영국에서 제목값이 2배로나 올랐어. 2배로나. 2배로나.
Mr. Allen, what do the communists have to say concerning our Air Force?
I'd like for you to listen to a broadcast from Moscow on that subject, which talks about the psycho-neurotic American pilots. Could we have that soundtrack?
You are tuned to Radio Moscow, broadcasting in the 16, 19, and 25-meter bands in the shortwave, and in the medium on 216.6 meters. An Associated Press dispatch tells us that an American Saberjet accidentally dropped some rockets over Florida. The population has been alerted and warned of the serious danger. This brought to mind a secret report of Dr. Frank Berry, medical assistant to the Secretary of Defense, which made me doubt that the rocket fall was the result of an accident. This report gives us every ground for questioning the possibility of accidents in general, since it claims that approximately 70% of the officers and enlisted men of the Air Force are psychoneurotic. What is more, checks have shown that the state of affairs is especially critical among the airmen doing steady nuclear patrol.
What are they saying about the United States Navy?
And the Marine Corps?
I've got a copy here of the Soviet newspaper that's published for their Navy called the Sovietsky Float, the Soviet fleet, May 18th of this year. It speaks about what's going on in the Mediterranean. It says, referring to the United States, over Lebanon hangs the real threat of military intervention by the imperialist states led by the United States. He says, the American command has doubled the landing forces attached to the Sixth Fleet. That's the Marine complement with the ships. The imperialists are openly brandishing weapons, threatening Lebanon. But no matter how much the colonizers try, they cannot intimidate the people of the Near and Middle East, and in particular the Lebanese people who have set on the road of defending the freedom and independence of their country. That's typical of the type of statements that the Soviets are making about the United States Navy and the Marine Corps, tools of imperialists, colonizers, Wall Street, so on.
Mr. Allen, don't the Soviets in their propaganda attempt to show also that Americans are opposed to all the colored races?
Yes, they do. I've seen that particularly when I was serving in the Far East and in India. They try to make it appear that the Americans are the most race-conscious people in the world. Actually, the experience of people in that part of the world dealing with Americans is the best way to counteract that. When our naval ships or our armed services units are stationed in those parts of the world, the integration that takes place in our armed services is the most useful way to combat that type of Soviet propaganda. Also, last fall we had a magnificent experience when Marian Anderson went out through the Far East and India making her appearances as an American and speaking to the people about the racial questions in the United States as an American Negro was an excellent counterweight to that Soviet propaganda.
I believe that Soviet film, Meeting on the Elbe, has a sequence charging us with racial discrimination and, in fact, fierce racial hatred. It might be interesting to take a look at that.